And at the beginning of this hearing, I would like to thank all the members, the witnesses, the press, and those visitors that we have today with the inclement weather that was predicted and some has fallen. We thought it was important to continue this hearing, so I'm grateful to each of our witnesses and to those that couldn't make it because of flights today. We have tried to adjust so we've got the appropriate witnesses for the second panel as well. Today, the committee convenes the first open hearing to reflect the progress and preliminary recommendations and findings of our investigation into Russia's attempt to interfere in the 2016 U.S. elections. I'd like to welcome our two distinguished witnesses, Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen and former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson. Jay, I am grateful for the service that you provided to your country in a number of places, and Secretary Nielsen, I have enjoyed very much the time that you have been there and look forward to what we can accomplish between this committee and the Department of Homeland Security in the future. I want to thank both of you for being here together, which I think is unprecedented, and I am grateful to the administration for agreeing. It speaks to the importance of the issue and sends a message that transcends partisanship. The Vice Chairman and I asked the two of you to appear together to tell the story of what happened in 2016, how the department reacted then, and how it has evolved and what it's doing today. I think your collective remarks will show the remarkable evolution of an agency that is playing an increasingly important role to support the states. When this cyber threat surfaced in 2016, many struggled to understand the attack, the intentions behind it, and how to respond. By the beginning of 2018, however, DHS has made great strides towards better understanding elections, better understanding the states, and providing assistance that makes a difference to the security of our elections. But there's more to do. There's a long wait time for DHS premier services. States are still not getting all the information they feel they need to secure their systems. The Department's ability to collect all the information needed to fully understand a problem is an open question. And attributing cyber attacks quickly and authoritatively is a continuing challenge. Secretary Nielsen, as you appropriately note in your statement, the administration of elections is the responsibility of the state and local officials. And the support your agency provides is on a voluntary basis. What we've learned is that states will only engage with the department if they feel there's value. And I'm confident that the customer service, if you can call it that, and the value you're providing to your state partners is improving every single day. Securing our elections requires immediate action, and the urgency is reflected in the committee's recommendations released yesterday. We've convened today's hearing in the midst of a snowstorm of sorts to speak to the American people publicly about the threat posed by Russia and the efforts by our federal, state, and local governments to protect against it. This issue is urgent. If we start to fix these problems tomorrow, we still might not be in time to save the system for 2016 and 2020. I understand, Secretary Nielsen, you have a hard stop, something about a cabinet meeting, and we respect those cabinet meetings when the President calls it. So in the interest of time, I will end there, and I will turn to the Vice Chairman for any remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to welcome the witnesses as well. Today's hearing comes at a critical time. The committee remains in the midst of our bipartisan investigation into the Russian attacks during the 2016 election, and we still have more work to do. However, we as a committee felt it was important to move out our initial findings and recommendations on securing our election infrastructure, given the upcoming elections in November. Our main question today is how do we protect the 2018 elections? And the threat is real and growing. During the 2016 campaign, we saw unprecedented targeting of election infrastructure by Russian actors. Russian hackers were able to penetrate Illinois' voter registration database and access 90,000 voter registration records. They also attempted to target the election systems of at least 20 other states. The intelligence community's assessment last January concluded that Russia secured and maintained access to multiple elements of U.S. state and local election boards. And the truth is clear that 2016 will not be the last of their attempts. Just weeks ago, we heard from all our top intelligence officials testifying before this committee that the Russians will continue to attack our elections. And unfortunately, there are signs that the Kremlin is becoming more brazen. As we saw recently, the Putin regime was behind an assassination attempt on a European soil with a prohibited military-grade nerve agent. This is obviously not the actions of a regime that will be easily deterred. So how are we prepared to come against this threat that we know is coming again? Elections at all levels are central to our democracy, to our institutions, and to our government's legitimacy. And I remain concerned that we're still not fully prepared. Candidly, and I've shared this with both of you, I was disappointed on how the Department of Homeland Security, the primary U.S. government agency responsible for our election security, approached this issue early on. During the 2016 election, officials at both the federal and state level were caught flat-footed, and the follow-up from the new administration was not much better. Last June, we heard from DHS, FBI, and state election officials about the threat to our election systems, which, based upon Secretary Johnson's earlier actions, DHS considers part of our nation's critical infrastructure. Despite evidence of interference, the federal government and the states had barely communicated about strengthening our defenses. It was not until the fall of 2017 that DHS even fully notified the states that they had been potential targets. And unfortunately, that was an issue that members of this committee, bipartisan, stressed in our hearing last June. Candidly, we have to improve those communications. But clearly, more must be done, from hardening our election, registration, and voting systems, to ensuring that voting machines have backup paper ballots, to instituting audits and providing additional federal assistance to those states that request it. And one area I know that we're not going to talk about today, but I think does need additional investigation, is how we make sure that the ultimate startups, campaigns, practice basic cybersecurity. The threat is real, and the need to act is urgent. We need the administration to accelerate its efforts. Perhaps most of all, we need a president who will acknowledge the gravity of this threat and lead a whole-of-society effort to harden our defenses and inoculate our society against Russia's malicious interference. The fact that the President did not even bring up the topic of our election security when he called Vladimir Putin to congratulate him on his victory in a pre-cooked election, I believe, is extremely troubling. The good news is this problem is not a Democratic or Republican one. And I personally want to thank all the members of the committee on both sides of the aisle for the good work that they've done. You're going to hear from some of them who've been working on a set of recommendations, and Senator Rubio has also been working on a set of recommendations. We all have to get this done, and we have to act quickly. Again, I'm pleased to have both of the secretaries here. I know it's a little bit unprecedented. I thank them both for being here and thank them for getting through the storm. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to our hearing.
I thank the Vice Chairman. This morning we'll hear from Secretary Nielsen and Secretary Johnson. Their testimony will be followed up by questions of up to 5 minutes from members, recognizing first Senator Collins, followed by Heinrich, Langford, Harris, the chair, the vice chair, and then members based upon seniority after that. Having covered that, Secretary Nielsen, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me here. I want to thank Chairman Burr, Vice Chairman Warner, and all the members of the committee for not only the opportunity to testify, but I really do want to thank you for your leadership, your bipartisan efforts here to assess what we did, what we didn't do, what we can do better in partnership really can't be overstated in terms of its importance. So I thank you for that. Before we begin, I just wanted to extend my thanks to the first responders who've been working around the clock in Texas on the package bombing case. At DHS, we've been in close contact with those on the ground, and although the situation appears to be over, we urge the public to remain alert and report any suspicious activity or packages or devices. Over the course of nearly 3 weeks, at least 7 explosive devices were encountered in and around the Austin area, with 5 of them unfortunately detonating. Our thoughts go out to the victims and their families, and our gratitude is extended to the frontline defenders who helped locate the alleged perpetrator. The suspect is now deceased, but the case is yet another stark reminder of the importance of both public vigilance and also how important it is for close federal, state, and local coordination. That coordination is also relevant, clearly, to the issue we have before us today. In a democracy, citizens must have faith that their vote counts and is counted correctly. Recently, in the United States and around the globe, we have seen malicious foreign actors attempt to subvert democracy by taking action to influence voters and by exploiting vulnerabilities in cyberspace to attack election systems. In 2016, we know that Russian actors targeted state election systems. We have no evidence that votes were changed as a result of their efforts. However, the threat of interference remains, and we recognize that the 2018 midterm and future elections are clearly potential targets for Russian hacking attempts. Today, we have a whole-of-government effort to improve the resilience and security of those systems, which is led by DHS with assistance from the Departments of Justice, the FBI, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We are working with the vendor community, and most importantly, we are working in voluntary partnership with our state and local election partners. There's also a separate initiative to address efforts by foreign nationals to influence our elections through messaging, propaganda, and manipulation. I think this is also a very important topic. That effort is being led by the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Department of State. While DHS will, of course, support this effort, I will let my colleagues discuss their work in that area. And instead, today, I look forward to discussing the work that the Department is doing to assist state and local officials to harden our election systems. Under our Constitution and laws, as has been mentioned by the Chairman and the Vice, the administration of elections is the responsibility of state and local officials. The Department's mission is to provide assistance and support to those officials in the form of advice, intelligence, technical support, incident response planning, with the ultimate goal of building a more resilient, redundant, and secure election enterprise. Our services are voluntary, and not all election officials accept our offer of support. We continue to offer it. We continue to demonstrate its value. But in many cases, state and local officials have their own resources and simply don't require the assistance that we're offering. DHS typically offers a range of technical services. We'll go into some detail today about those. More than half of the states have signed up for our cyber hygiene scanning service, which is an automated remote scan that gives state and local officials a report identifying vulnerabilities and offering recommendations to mitigate them. We also provide, as I believe you all have noted, on-site risk and vulnerability assessments. The assessments are more thorough. We do pen testing. It's a full report of vulnerability and recommendations. And over the past year, we've increased the availability of these assessments and prioritized them. Information sharing is also critical. We share information directly with election officials through trusted third parties, such as the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or MS-ISAC, and we look forward to the creation of the election ISAC. The National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, or the NCIC, is the Department's hub for information sharing activity. Actionable and timely information empowers election officials to make more risk-informed decisions. We must rapidly share information about potential compromises with the broader community so that everyone can defend their systems. This collective defense approach makes all election systems more secure. We're also working with state election officials to share classified information on specific threats, including sponsoring up to 3 officials per state with security clearances and providing one-day read-ins as needed when needed, as we did in mid-February for the Secretaries of State and election directors. We are also working with the intelligence community to rapidly declassify information to share with our stakeholders. To be clear, there has been a learning curve on the sharing of information. The election systems in states are often owned and operated by different systems. The Secretary of State, the state CIO, in some cases the state CISO, the governor's office, or even counties. While appropriate technical information and notifications were shared with system owners, we have taken steps to share information much more broadly and rapidly. Beyond sharing information, we also share best practices for risk management, such as paper ballot backups and risk-limiting audits. The ultimate goal, of course, is enhancing network protection, but we must be prepared for any eventuality, including unauthorized access to systems. The NCIC is again the center of these efforts. Every day, our protective security advisors and cybersecurity advisors located nationwide are working with election officials on incident response planning and crisis communications. Just yesterday, we had both our head of our NPPD as well as our cybersecurity advisor in Cook County, real-time, helping in case there was any issue with the election. DHS is committed to working collaboratively with those administrating our elections. We have formalized and better coordinated these efforts through the establishment of government and sector coordinating councils. And today I can say with confidence that we know whom to contact in every state to share threat information. That capability did not exist in 2016. DHS is leading federal efforts to support and enhance the security of election systems across the country. Yet we do face a technology deficit that exists not just in election infrastructure, but across state and local government systems. It will require a significant investment over time and will require a whole-of-government solution to ensure continued confidence in our elections. Personally, I'm looking across my existing authorities as Secretary of the Department and looking at our available grant programs for opportunities to help state and locals in this area. I look forward to working with Congress. I read with great interest the recommendations that were released yesterday from your study, and certainly look forward to working with you on implementing them. Thank you for the opportunity to appear, and I look forward to your questions.
Secretary Nielsen, thank you very much. Secretary Johnson, you are recognized. The floor is yours.
Chairman Burr, Vice Chairman Warner, other members of this committee, I am pleased to be here alongside the Secretary of Homeland Security as a witness and a concerned private citizen. I had the privilege of testifying before Congress 26 times in 37 months as Secretary, and if I'm not called back once in a while, I begin to feel left out. I'm also pleased that this committee has undertaken this hearing on this important topic of election cybersecurity. You have my prepared statement. I won't read it in detail. It sets forth the efforts we made in the Department of Homeland Security in 2016 to assist states in securing their election infrastructure prior to the election, and the 5 written public statements I made warning the public and the states about the cyber threat to the election. Beyond that, I'd like to say this. As each member of this committee knows, in 2016, the Russian government, at the direction of Vladimir Putin himself, orchestrated cyber attacks on our nation for the purpose of influencing the election that year, plain and simple. The experience was a wake-up call for our nation as it highlighted cyber vulnerabilities in our political process and in our election infrastructure itself. Now, with the experience fresh in our minds and clear in our rearview mirror, the key question for our leaders at the national and state level is, what are we going to do about it? The matter is all the more urgent given the public testimony our nation's intelligence chiefs gave before this very committee last month that the Russian effort to interfere in our democracy has not ended. I have seen this committee's draft recommendations for the future, and I agree with them. The reality is that given our electoral college and our current politics, national elections are decided in this country in a few precincts in a few key swing states. The outcome, therefore, may dance on the head of a pin. The writers of the TV show House of Cards have figured that out. So can others. I am pleased by reports that state election officials to various degrees are now taking serious steps to fortify cybersecurity of their election infrastructure, and that the Department of Homeland Security is currently taking serious steps to work with them in that effort. As a nation, we must resolve to strengthen our cybersecurity generally and the cybersecurity around election infrastructure specifically. Nothing less than the health and strength of our democracy depends on this. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Johnson. It seems more than normal, issues recently coming before this committee are not the jurisdiction of the committee. And were it not for the investigation, elections would not be the jurisdiction of this committee. But given the nature of our investigation, we have developed a committee of somewhat experts now on elections and election relationships between the federal government and the state. And that's why we asked Senator Collins, Senator Lankford, Senator Harris, and Senator Heinrich to take the lead as it related to election security. At this time, I would like to recognize Senator Collins for questions, followed by Heinrich, Lankford, and Harris. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, let me thank you and the Vice Chairman for your strong bipartisan leadership of this investigation. Secretary Johnson, let me begin by thanking you for your extensive public service, and I very much appreciate your being here. In the summer and fall of 2016, DHS and the FBI issued several technical warnings about possible activities against state election systems. These warnings took the form of a flash report or a similarly technical bulletin, and generally the warnings went to the IT staff of states and not to the chief election officials. I've read one of the FBI flash bulletins. It is extremely complex, and it just refers to unknown actors scanning systems. In retrospect, do you think that it would have been better had the FBI and DHS issued a more comprehensive warning that a nation state was attempting hostile action against state election systems?
Let me respectfully disagree somewhat with your premise. I, in the fall, in August, September, October, issued 5 written statements to the public encouraging state election officials to come in and seek our cybersecurity assistance over and above the technical messages that you cited in mid-August, mid-September, October 1, October 7, October 10. On October 1st, specifically, I said, in recent months, malicious cyber actors have been scanning a large number of state systems, which could be a preamble to attempted intrusions. In a few cases, we have determined that malicious actors gained access to state voting-related systems. That's a pretty blunt statement, in my view. We weren't then in a position in our intelligence community to attribute it to the Russian government, nor were we on October 7th. We said it was coming from a Russian business, but we weren't then in a position to say it was the Russian government. We later said that, however. But I can tell you that in addition to these public statements and in addition to the work of our people, we were beating the drum pretty hard, beginning with a conference call I had with every state secretary of state on August 15th. And the good news is that by Election Day, 33 states actually came in and sought our cybersecurity assistance, and 36 cities and counties came in and sought our cybersecurity assistance in the time permitted. Very definitely, Senator, as we look back on the experience 2 years later, and we have a much clearer picture of the full extent of what the Russian government was doing, there could have been additional efforts made, but I'm satisfied that at the time, this was a front burner item for me, and I was repeatedly making public statements warning state election officials about the threat we were facing as it was evolving.
Secretary Nielsen, at this point, we know for certain that the Russians were relentless in their efforts, and also that those efforts are ongoing. And yet, when I listen to your testimony, I hear no sense of urgency to really get on top of this issue. When we held our last hearing in June, I was dismayed to learn that not a single chief state election official had received a security clearance nearly 8 months after the 2016 elections. We already are in an election year. We've had the by-elections in Virginia and New Jersey. We've had special elections in Pennsylvania and Alabama. Our main primary is in June. What specifically is DHS doing to accommodate what you said was sponsoring 3 officials per state for clearances? That's 150 officials. How many have actually received the clearances, and what specific actions did you take in the elections that have already occurred?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. Let me just first start by saying not only is this of extreme urgency to the department, but as you know, we're expending not only extraordinary resources to provide any support at the request of states, but we are prioritizing election efforts and risk and vulnerability assessments for our partners in state and locals over all other critical infrastructure sectors. With respect to the security clearances, we've done 2 things. We've worked out a process with the interagencies such that if we have intel, we will read in the appropriate state election officials that day. So we're not waiting for clearances. If we have something to share, we will read them in and share it that day. With respect to the clearances, we are doing our best to speed up the process. We've prioritized them, as I said, over other clearances for other sectors. We have about 20 that have received the full clearance. We're granting interim secret clearances as quickly as we can.
20 out of 150?
Yes, ma'am. And so we look, I've spoken with the chairman and the vice chair just before. We certainly look forward to working with this committee government-wide on how we can speed up the security clearances. But the good news, again, is if we have something to share, we will share that day, that with or without a clearance. We'll read them in and share it. So it won't limit our ability to get the information to them any longer.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, Secretary Johnson said in his testimony just now that he agreed with the committee's recommendations. Do you share that view?
I do, yes. And as I said in my opening remarks, I look forward to working with you all on implementing them. As you know, some of them aren't DHS, so I will be happy to advocate and support efforts throughout government.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson, I know hindsight's obviously 20/20, but if looking back, knowing what you know now, what might have you done different or advocated differently in the run-up to the 2016 election?
Well, the thing that I advocated for most strongly, and that others, obviously including the President, agreed with, was prior to the election, we needed to inform the American people about what we saw. Some people say we should have done so sooner, but it was not an easy decision. With the benefit of 2 years hindsight, it does seem plain, given the testimony in this room last month, that the Russian effort has not been contained, it has not been deterred. In my experience, superpowers respond to sufficient deterrence and will not engage in behavior that is cost prohibitive. Plainly, that has not occurred, and more needs to be done. With the benefit of hindsight, the sanctions we issued in late December have not worked as an effective deterrent, and it's now on the current administration to add to those and follow through on those.
So do you think, for example, having a very clear, articulated cyber doctrine would be an important part of sending that message of deterrence?
Yes, I agree with that. Yes.
Secretary Nielsen, are you concerned that over a year into this administration, and despite the urging of people on both sides of the aisle on multiple committees, that we still don't have a clear administrative doctrine that draws some, that says to the Russians or others that there will be consequences if you cross this line into our elections?
Apologies. I agree with your comments yesterday at the press conference, sir. As you know, we have an executive order 13800 that requires us to develop just that. Working with the intel community, I look forward to supporting their efforts. It does need to be whole of government. As the Secretary is saying, we have sanctions, but we need to continue to look at diplomats. We need to look at indictments. We need to look at what we can do under OFAC. It needs to be very clear that there are consequences when countries meddle in our affairs.
I don't disagree that it needs to be whole of government, but one of my concerns is that no one's saying the buck stops here. We keep hearing whole of government. We heard it in our worldwide threats hearing recently. But someone has to take the responsibility to make this happen. How many cabinet meetings have been focused on the whole of government strategy to make sure that in 2018 this doesn't happen again?
We have had a number of them. We actually have a number coming up, but I take your point. I'm a very strong advocate of making it very clear who has the lead within the federal government for this particular issue.
How important is it? You know, one of my concerns is that we won't be able to get state and local officials to take the Russian cyber threat or other cyber threats seriously unless they consistently hear from the highest levels of government that this is real, that their systems are truly at risk, that they need to prepare. Director Nielsen, do you have the support you need from the White House to persuade those officials to take this seriously?
I do, yes. And I think one of the lessons we've learned is to make sure that those messages go far and wide. So I've briefed the Homeland Security advisors, I've briefed governors, in addition to the state election officials and secretaries of state. But to your point, within the states, because of our decentralized system, it's very important that everyone at senior levels understands the threat and is briefed in.
Would it help if the president were to simply acknowledge that this happened in 2016?
Yes, sir. I think he has said that it's happened. The line that he's drawing is that no votes were changed. That doesn't mean there's not a threat. It doesn't mean we need to do more to prepare.
Secretary Johnson, in your view, how important is it for the president to articulate and acknowledge that this happened so that people take it seriously?
Very. The President of the United States is the most visible American, maybe the most visible person on the planet. And the things he says and does are watched very, very closely. So I would agree with that.
Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Langford.
Thank you both for the work that you have done. I'd be able to support the nation. Appreciate you both being here and both being on this panel together. I appreciate that very much. The decentralization of our election systems is exceptionally important. And one of the key aspects that we've tried to work through on recommendations is maintaining the state's control of elections. Both of you have affirmed that. Both of you have also affirmed the recommendations that we have put in place. I appreciate that. We've worked with DHS. We've worked with secretaries of state around the country to try to be able to pull these recommendations together to be able to do it, including streamlining the communications between DHS and each of the states, updating voting equipment that can't be and voting systems that can't be audited after the fact to just get verifiable information in that system. So we think that's exceptionally important. Secretary Nielsen, can you affirm to me that there is no effort from the federal government right now to be able to federalize our elections, that the focus is still on working with states to be able to support them in the work that they're doing to be able to run their elections?
Absolutely.
Talk to me a little bit about, Secretary Nielsen, about the classifications and getting classified information to individual secretaries of state. This was a struggle in previous times during that election time period, getting information out. What would make a difference now, having clearances for individuals in the states and being able to communicate with them? What can you give to them with clearance that you couldn't give to them without?
It's a good question. We've done a lot of work on three related processes over the last year. One is to work with the intel community to declassify information. As you know, some of the information does not originate within DHS, so we need to work with our partners to be able to share it. The second one is on victim notification. We have a role there, but so does FBI, and so does MS-ISAC, which in this case, the Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center, was in some cases the first organization to identify some of the targeting. And so we have to work with whomever originates the information. We all have different different roles. So we've worked to pull it all together so that we can quickly notify victims of what has occurred. With respect to your specific question, as I mentioned to Senator Collins, what we've done is we're widely using day read-ins now. So we're not going to let security clearances hold us up. If we have information state and locals need, we will provide it.
So, Secretary Johnson, you had some states give you pushback when you talked about things like making states critical infrastructure in their election systems and trying to be able to get that communication. You talked about an August 15th phone call that you had with Secretaries of State to be able to talk to them. Talk me through what happened in that August 15th phone call. Is that a normally scheduled phone call? Was there consistent communication? And the things that Secretary Nielsen's dealing with now and that two-way communication that's much needed and that trust relationship, some of the things that you faced as well, trying to be able to maintain trust with state election officials.
Incidentally, Senator, last summer, I had the occasion to drive across country and return to Oklahoma City to the memorial there.
And thanks for being there again.
So, August 15th, I was considering designating critical election infrastructure, which the Secretary of Homeland Security has the authority to do. But I wanted to talk to state election officials about it first. I was frankly surprised and disappointed that there seemed to be a lot of misapprehension about what that would mean. And I said to them a number of times that what it means is that we prioritize providing assistance to you if you ask. This is voluntary. It's not a federal takeover. It's not a binding operational directive of any sort. And the reaction I got was largely neutral to negative. And so the priority had to be getting the states to come to us to seek our cybersecurity assistance. So rather than just simply make that designation, which I saw was going to be controversial at the time, we put it aside and encouraged them to come in, and most states actually did by Election Day. After the election, I came back to this issue. A lot of them were still opposed, but I did it anyway, so that DHS would prioritize providing cybersecurity assistance to the states. And when we talk about cyber doctrine, one international cyber norm is that nation states will not attack critical infrastructure. And so by making election infrastructure part of critical infrastructure, they get the protection of the international cyber norm.
Thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Secretary Nielsen, at a roundtable 42 days ago at the Homeland Security Committee meeting, I asked Deputy Secretary Duke and Undersecretary Krebs whether DHS is prioritizing risk and vulnerability assessments for the states. I didn't get a clear commitment that you are. And I'd also like to know, have you received the request that we made for a timetable for those assessments, because we've not received a response to that request?
Yes, ma'am. We are prioritizing. We have 19 that are state and localities that are either been completed or in process. We continue to offer the assistance, but we have made the commitment and prioritized resources that any state or locality that requests that, we will have it completed before the midterm election.
Do you have a date for completion?
Of the 19, I can get back to you, but those are the only ones who have requested so far.
Can you commit to completing all these assessments by June 1st, which would be 5 months before the election?
Depending on who requests, but I'm happy to work with you on timelines as soon as we get a request.
And of the number you mentioned, you said have been completed or in the process?
Yes, that's correct.
How many have been completed?
To my knowledge, 15. If that's not correct, I'll ask Jeanette Manfred to correct me when she speaks.
Okay, because you earlier said in the process of or have been completed.
That's right. So I believe 15 have been completed, but again, she'll verify if I have that number wrong.
Okay, well, we heard from her yesterday, and she said that 14 are in the process.
Okay.
So
that's 19
total. Can you follow up with how many have actually been completed?
Sure. And it's also a little confusing because, of course, there's states and localities. So 19 is states and localities.
Okay, my question concerns states. Thank
Perfect.
you. And is there a protocol for following up to ensure that the reforms that you recommend have actually been completed?
We do continue to work with them through hygiene, scanning, and others.
Is there a protocol to do that?
So that is the protocol that we offer. But again, it's all voluntary, so it's not a mandatory check.
Okay. In the intelligence community, there's a concept called duty to warn. And Secretary Johnson, I'd like to ask you, and essentially the concept is that if a federal agency learns that a person is at a risk of imminent harm or an entity is at risk, that they should be informed, and obviously without giving up critical information that we have in terms of sources and methods. Do you believe in the future that the department should have a duty to warn states if the Department of Homeland Security is informed that there are imminent cybersecurity threats to their election systems?
Yes, absolutely.
Secretary Nielsen, do you agree with that?
Yes.
And will you commit then to this committee that you will, in fact, warn those states when you become aware of imminent threat to their cybersecurity systems for elections?
With the interagency, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when you learn of these threats, will you also commit to informing immediately congressional committees, and particularly the Intelligence Committee?
As you know, we will work with you on that. As you know, the entire process is voluntary. What we find is when we notify others of who the victims are, unfortunately, it has a chilling effect, and we no longer get the information from those who have been attacked. So we'll continue to work with you on how to do that.
So my question is, will you commit to specifically informing the Senate Intelligence Committee when you become aware of those threats?
We'll continue to work with you on the best protocols for that, yes.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is it's very difficult if a state does not want to be identified because it's a voluntary relationship. I don't want to do anything that would limit our ability to understand who is being attacked. So we'd have to work with the victim, just like we do in any other sector, and work with you to make sure that we do it in the right way.
Would you commit to informing your oversight committee, which is the Homeland Security Committee of the United States Senate?
I understand your question, and again, we'll have to work with the victims. It's a voluntary system.
You sit on the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, is that correct?
I'm a member, yes.
Okay, and that committee is comprised of cabinet officials and is responsible for advising the President and coordinating policy on America's most serious national security challenges. Has the Principals Committee held a meeting focused on the security of the 2018 election?
I myself hosted it, yes.
And when did that meeting take place?
A few weeks ago.
And what decisions were made regarding election security?
That state and locals remain in charge, that DHS needs to continue to expand our toolkit of what we can provide and support, that we need to work on tear lines, we need to work on victim notification, we need to work on clearances, and we need to work on communications to make sure that the public is aware of the threat.
And did you indicate timelines and due dates for what should happen before the 2018 election?
Well, clearly everything should be done before that. But yes, for each one of those, we have an agreement on a path forward. With
Will you provide that to this committee?
Happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Harris. The chair would recognize himself and then the vice chairman and then members based upon seniority. Secretary Johnson, I remember very clearly when you called a Gang of 8 meeting for the notification, and if I remember my timing right, I think Senator Reid actually might have had a brief the end of July because he happened to be in town, and when everybody got back the 1st of September, you sat down with us and sort of presented us the scenario, and at that time talked about the critical infrastructure designation. It was followed some weeks after that by an all-members brief in the Senate. I'm sure it was in the House as well. And I think you alluded to the fact that that was not received by the states or election officials, the critical infrastructure designation. In hindsight, for us knowing going forward, was that a mistake to even mention that? Did that taint the pool of their trust with us, with government, and maybe what the intent was on their part?
Well, we put it aside, and I was very pleased with the level of participation that we got. I thought it was important. I thought that the critical infrastructure designation, frankly, is something we should have done years before. It made so much sense. I think that the disadvantage we had with the timing was that it was in the midst of an election year, and a rather heated election year. So I did put it aside, but then I, just before leaving office, came back to it because I thought it was something important to do. But in answer to your question, Senator, I think that we were able to build, in the time permitted, a pretty constructive relationship with a lot of states, red states and blue states, that all came to DHS to seek our assistance in the election season.
I appreciate that, and even Secretary Nielsen's reluctance to be able to say I would definitely do it this way. Let me just say, in our hearings, we found that states do not want a critical infrastructure designation, that there's a red line there. And I think we've learned as this has gone on. We've seen it. It's visceral. It's something that can be overcome with trust. And I think that's why as we produce benefits to the customer, which is any official or locality that has an election, then we gain a little bit more trust. We gain a little bit more ability to play a bigger role in the partnership, but not in taking over. And I want to make it clear, our recommendations do not intend or suggest that the government take over elections. It's not the Secretary or the Department's view of that, and it wasn't from the last administration. But that designation did affect their willingness to come in and ask for help and suggest where problems were that they saw. Let me ask both of you. I'll start with you, Secretary Johnson. In 2016, were there any votes that were affected by this intrusion into any system in America?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Secretary Nielsen?
We have no evidence that any votes were changed.
Secretary Nielsen, looking forward ahead to 2018, what is DHS's current estimation of the threat to our elections from Russia or any other hostile actor?
Thank you for the question. I think, as you've noted, many of you in the press conference yesterday, unfortunately, once these vulnerabilities have been made clear, it's not just Russia that we have to worry about, right? These are vulnerabilities and attack vectors that any adversary could pursue. So we think the threat remains high. We think vigilance is important, and we think there's a lot that we all need to do at all levels of government before we have the midterm elections. I will say our decentralized nature both makes it difficult to have a nationwide effect, but also makes it perhaps of greater threat at a local level. And of course, if it's a swing state or swing area, that can in turn have a national effect. So what we're looking at is everything from registration and validation of voters, so those are the databases, through to the casting and the tabulation of votes, through to the transmission, the election night reporting, and then of course the certification and the auditing on the back end. All of those are potential vulnerabilities. All of those require different tools and different attention by state and locals. The last thing I would just quickly mention is we all continue to work with state and locals to also help them look at physical security. They need to make sure that the locations where the voting machines are kept, as well as the tabulation areas. They need access control and very traditional security like we would in other critical infrastructure areas.
I thank both of you, and let me just say for the public's education, there's a clear distinction between what we're here to talk about today, which is the election process and how an outside actor could impact or influence that, and versus, say, Russia's distinct campaign at societal chaos and their use of social media platforms. That's another area of investigation by this committee, but this particular area is focused on the elections and the process of one vote and it counts and that there's accuracy in that count. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on some of the line of Senator Harris's question, and I'm sympathetic to the notion that you've got to have this collaborative relationship with the states, and I think the recommendations put forward by our members don't want to take over the federal election. But for both of you, because we know this is such a serious problem, because we know the Russians are, and potential others are coming at this, I think it is critical that even if you don't want to highlight this, someone needs to highlight those states or localities that perhaps choose not to participate or not to move to a paper trail. I have empathy for Secretary Johnson's notion of calling elections critical infrastructure. I think they are, but I get the notion of the pushback. So how do we work through that? And I believe the public does have a right to know if their state or if their community basically is ignoring this problem. briefly from both if you could.
Senator, there's actually a role for the United States Senate to play in this.
We're trying.
During 2016, if I had resistance from a state, I would call one of you and say, would you please call your governor? Would you please call your Secretary of State and tell them that they really need to come to us for assistance? And I did have that conversation with at least one senator I recall very distinctly, and I thought it was effective.
Nielsen?
I agree. I would say that there are 33 states right now who have their voting system certified by EAC. I think that's important. We should seek for all states to do that. There's 35 states that require it by law. So we'll continue to work with EAC on those voluntary voting system guidelines. But DHS is also working on our own baseline. That would be a much more comprehensive look at all of the cybersecurity aspects within the election process. We intend to provide that to you, and we intend to ask states to meet it. We have 2 states who aren't working with us as much as we would like right now. We're working through that. But yes, our intent would be to go to those congressional delegations and get some help from you.
I think it's very important because I understand you've got to have a cooperative relationship, but I do think our constituents, our voters, need to know if a state or a jurisdiction is not stepping up. We've talked a lot about the actual voting machines, and Senator Wyden may come to this issue when his time is up. But when you look at a overall state or locality's voter file, oftentimes those voter files are maintained by an outside vendors. Many of those outside vendors then collect all the information as single points. So you may not have to go through simply the state system, but you could actually attack the vendors. Could you address what we're doing to try to upgrade security at the vendor level?
Sure. So we're working with vendors on supply chain. So we have launched a voluntary supply chain initiative within DHS across all sectors, but also to help the vendors understand the part and parcel that comprises the machines that they sell, that they offer. We also have a system called, or a program called Enhanced Cybersecurity Services. It's a version of our Einstein program where we take classified indicators and we offer that through the private sector to vendors and states alike. We have 6 states taking us up on that and multiple vendors within the vendor community.
Well, I would make a request that, again, similar to the states and localities, if there are vendors who are unwilling to cooperate or upgrade their security, I think it's critically important that this committee and other committees know so that perhaps we can bring pressure as well. I think that is an enormous vulnerability. We've looked at the systems, but I think the vendors who service those systems, and I hope, Secretary Johnson, you'd agree with that. Let me get to one other area. Our committee's investigation has been about election systems and security and how we can protect ourselves going forward. One area that we know where the Russians penetrated in 2016 was actually the campaigns, their ability to hack into the DNC and release that information on a selected basis. Campaigns in many ways are the ultimate startups. They have very little security built in. This does not fit neatly into any governmental oversight. But do you have recommendations for us? And the policy recommendations so far have been around systems. But should there be basic cyber hygiene guidelines for campaigns? And I'd like to hear from both of you on that topic.
Yes, Senator, and the answer is yes. Campaigns are not immune from nation-state surveillance, nation-state hacking. I was very specific in not including political campaigns in the critical infrastructure designation because I didn't think it was appropriate. But, you know, you could go on with a long list of infrastructure that needs certain basic best practices, whether it's a political campaign, a utility, an academic institution. And so I would agree with that, yes. So we've seen a number of instances where political campaigns, the email systems of campaigns have been hacked and data information has been stolen, going back years, as you know.
Recognizing it's voluntary, Secretary Nielsen.
I completely agree. We are offering a variety of services there as well. The hygiene scanning, as you mentioned, as well as just basic redundancy planning. Again, the issue here is that the information that in the voter rolls, the databases might be changed in some way. So having some way to audit that, to have redundancy, resiliency, we're working on planning with them and helping them understand best practices for just basic continuity of operations. But yes, you're hitting on another vulnerability that should be considered.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you both for being here. This is an important topic that I think is misunderstood. A lot of people focus on it as far as did they change the results of the election. So I sat down last night and I thought to myself, you know, if you were one of these, what's a hypothetical that could point to people how serious a problem this can become in the future. So here's a hypothetical scenario, and I want you both to kind of opine whether that's something that could happen and whether I'm right in my assumptions, all right? So let's assume for a moment that the year is 2020 or 2024, and there's a foreign leader who's tired of being lectured about democracy in their own country, and they decide they want to create chaos in the United States and create doubts about our legitimacy, so he or she orders an operation against our presidential election. And now for the last 5 or 6 years, this foreign power has identified ways to penetrate election officials at the state and the county level across America. There's so many of these that there's just this target-rich environment. And one of the things they've perfected over the years, for example, in this hypothetical, is the ability to inject misinformation into the bloodstream of the internet. And they watch as this misinformation spreads like a virus until a significant number of people believe it. They've also perfected, by the way, strategic leaking of altered or factual information, which the mainstream media picks up on, and it fits perfectly into their red versus blue dynamic that plays out on cable news, making them unwitting agents. So the plan of this foreign power in 2020 or 2024 in this hypothetical would not be to change the election results. It would be to create doubts about the validity of the election and then spread those doubts using social media and media driven by red versus blue conflict, and ultimately call into question the legitimacy of a new president and potentially even trigger a constitutional crisis. So what they do is they penetrate the voter database of local election officials in strategically located counties or states, and then they use analytic information they may have gotten from who knows where, or voter to identify specific voters, or maybe just party registration, maybe the stolen data of a campaign with identified supporters, and they use that information to go into the database, and they change the addresses of individuals, thereby their precincts move around, maybe they even delete some people from the rolls. And the result is that on Election Day, we start getting reports about thousands of voters in different parts of the country who can't vote because when they show up, they're not registered. They're not in the system. Or they show up and they're told that their voting place is halfway across town somewhere else. Interestingly, a significant number of these voters who start complaining about this happen to be either of the same party or at least self-identified partisans of, let's just call it, candidate A. And they live in a county or in a state that miraculously happens to be controlled by government officials of the opposite party. So these reports start getting out there, and suddenly, magically, a bunch of these names on social media start spreading all these reports about what's going on in Election Day. Here's the other thing this foreign government's been able to figure out. This is all hypothetical. They've also been able to mess with the system that kind of posts the results early. Not the ultimate results, but just like unofficial results. And so that evening, these results start coming up, and surprisingly, candidate A is doing better than candidate B, and people are surprised by it. But then the official results come back, and it's a total reversal. So what happens, as you can imagine at that point, is candidate A refuses to concede. There's this all-out fight going on in American society. In the months to come, millions of people march on Washington to try to force the Electoral College not to certify. The reverse millions come out the other side. Come January, we don't even know if we can swear in a president. The military doesn't know who the commander-in-chief is. We're in an all-out constitutional crisis, total chaos. For the first time in 200 and something years, the American Republic is under duress from the inside out. That sounds like something from a novel or a drama, a dramatic presentation in the movies. How far-fetched is this, given the capability of foreign adversaries? Is this not the central threat that faces us when it comes to elections and the integrity of our election systems? And the reason why I ask is not because anyone on this committee doubts it, but because we also have local state officials across the country who do not have this perspective, this broader perspective. To them, it's just about whether or not they could change the tallies. You don't have to change the tallies to create all-out chaos. Is that not the central threat here?
Yes, Senator. I actually believe that the first half of your hypothetical was not a hypothetical. The second half of your hypothetical, insofar as votes, was my biggest concern in the fall of 2016 when we saw the scanning and probing around voter registration data. And that's a very real threat, in my judgment. The other point I'd like to make about your hypothetical, in the fall of 2016, prior to the election, I thought long and hard about where the single points of failure are that could create that scenario. And the thing that occurred to me was Associated Press. Associated Press, for years, has been the entity on which we rely to report state election results to the rest of the media. And so I actually picked up the phone and called the CEO of the Associated Press to go over with him to ensure that he had enough redundancies in their system if there was a failure on election night, and I was satisfied that they did. But it's something to also focus on. But I think your hypothetical is a very good one, and I think all Americans should be concerned about it.
I agree. I think what you have highlighted are all the various parts at which we need to make sure that we are securing the system, because any one of those, as you say, can create that doubt, which in and of itself is perhaps what the adversary is trying to accomplish. So from a DHS perspective moving forward, we're looking very carefully at how we can help entities at all of the places that you described protect their databases, as we saw in the summer of 2016 with the structured query language, the SQL injections and attempts to manipulate the databases. We'll be scanning for that should someone take us up on our offer. Provisional ballots become very important for the reasons you've described. States should plan for what happens on Election Day if a variety of voters appear and suddenly they're not on the rolls but believe that they should be. We will have people in SOCs throughout the country. We will be stood up 24/7 on any Election Day to provide immediate incident response should anything come up. And then, as the Secretary mentioned, on election night, it's very important to work with AP and others before the election results are formally certified and audited to ensure that there's not information that's put out. So what I would suggest is that we all look at your what you would call a hypothetical, but as the Secretary rightly points out, is probably closer to a very good possibility, and walk through each of those and make sure that we are providing the tools and resources we need to state and locals so that they can prevent, identify, track, and then respond to any such issues.
Senator Rubio said hypothetical, but if I hear he's doing a book tour, we're going to all claim a royalty off of this. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think Senator Rubio hit the nail on the head. And I'll tell you what surprises me. First of all, Secretary Johnson, it's great to have you back again. I enjoyed working with you, and so welcome. Let me ask you this first question. I don't understand. You learned about this in August. You did a number of specific things. You spoke about the dates that you did these things. And yet, the American people were never told. Why?
Well, Senator, the American people were told.
Not sufficiently in any way, shape, or form to know that there was a major active measure going on, perhaps by a foreign power.
On October 7th, 2016, the Director of National Intelligence and I issued a pretty blunt statement saying that the Russian government was interfering in our political process directed by the highest levels of the Russian government. That was a pretty blunt statement. Some people believe we should have done that sooner. And frankly, it did not get the attention that I thought it should have received. It was below the fold news the next day because of the release of the Access Hollywood video the same day and a number of other events. I was expecting follow-up from a lot of journalists, and we never got that because everyone was focused on the campaign and that video and the debate that Sunday.
Right? Yeah. As I recall, I was ranking, and as I also recall, Senator Burr and I and a couple of others had Mr. Brennan in, Chafee, not Coates, Well, it was Brennan, it was the head of it was Comey, and it was and Clapper, who laid it out to us. Now, this was highly secret. Subsequently, it became known that there were 21 states that, in fact, had been pierced. Mm-hmm. But that information as to what states has not been released. So when we first heard, it was highly secret, in a skiff. We could say nothing about it. And even now, where I see no reason that 21 states can't be released as having been even possibly pierced by an active measure of a foreign country at this time. So those states would at least know that maybe they should take a look and do something about it. If either of you can answer that, it's not in a question form, but I think you know where I'm going, because if we're told, and it's all classified, we can say nothing. If this is being done by the administration to prevent it from being released, nobody can protect themselves.
Senator, two things. First, as Secretary Nielsen pointed out, very often the victims of a cyber attack are extremely sensitive to the fact of a disclosure that they were the victims of a cyber attack, and that was true in this circumstance. I also know and recall that in 2016, when we were working with the states, every state or every state owner of a system that had been targeted was informed either by DHS or the FBI or through the MSISAC, the Information Sharing Organization.
But it was never made public, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Nielsen, I don't understand why the same thing persists. I mean, this victim sort of appellation, America's the victim. And America has to know what's wrong. And if there are states that have been attacked, America should know that. So this victim answer with me has no credibility at all.
Apologies. So as you know, the 21 states themselves have been notified. But I take your point.
But people have to know,
no, ma'am,
my state is notified, I better see that they do something about it.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks, oh, it's some other state.
Right. No, I understand. I look forward to reading your report and finding out what you heard from the states. I think what I was trying to explain earlier is, unfortunately, what we've seen in other sectors.
There was no report.
The one that you're working on, I'm sorry, the report. I just look forward to reading it to see what you've, because I know you've talked to many of the states yourselves. But what we've seen, unfortunately, throughout the last 15 years at DHS is when it comes to this situation, the victims stop reporting. When they stop reporting, we're just not aware of the attacks. Not only can we not help them, but we can't help other victims that are likely to be victimized in the near future based on the same vulnerabilities. So we have to balance that. I really look forward to working with you on this. I take your point. We've got to find a way to encourage reporting and encourage cooperation while also making it transparent.
But I think states have to know that it's going to be known by the public if they don't. And if it's never made public, I'll bet you have a bunch of states, well, we've invested in this and we're not going to do anything about it now and we'll see what happens in the future. I'll bet that happens in some places. And you're enabling it.
Well, I think what we're doing at DHS is we'll come out with this, as I mentioned before. EAC has the guidelines, but we're working on a baseline that's much more comprehensive. What we will do is not only tell states that that's our best recommendation at what they need to meet, but we'll be very transparent as to the states that don't meet it. So we will do that from a preparedness side and a prevention standpoint. We will make clear what states need to do more. But in terms of moving forward, yes, we need to work on this issue of the notification.
Senator Feinstein and I were faced with a similar task as it related to cybersecurity legislation. Do you make it mandatory reporting? Do you make it voluntary? If you make it voluntary, what latitude do you have to make public disclosures of who has turned in information? And we decided with that legislation that voluntary was the best approach for cyber reporting. and it was up to the companies then to whether they wanted to make public acknowledgments. I think all of us know that the banking system is riddled with intrusions, but no financial institution in America wants to go out and that to be public. Right. So we do have a predicament, but
that may change.
That may change.
Get our fill of this.
The committee is committed to work with the Department of Homeland Security to continue to make our system better. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, you know, we do know that the fabric of democracy is people's belief that what happened on Election Day was what actually happened. So securing those systems important, securing the systems of registration important. Now, Secretary Johnson, you mentioned following Senator Rubio's great hypothetical of what clearly could happen. You said it's not hypothetical. Now, you didn't mean by that this is what happened, did you?
I thought that the first half of Senator Rubio's hypothetical, as I heard it, was real.
You think that
insofar as the misinformation campaign that he describes in his
I thought what you were talking about was the infiltration of the registration system.
No, that was my that is hypothetical, but it was my biggest concern in 2016.
Well, it is a concern. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, we've never had an election where, let me see if I can find your quote, Secretary Nielsen, where a number of voters didn't appear on Election Day who were not on the voting rolls but thought they were. You know, I was a state election official. I was a local election official. There is never an election where lots of people don't show up, particularly a presidential election, and they're sure they should be on the rolls.
Right.
But often there are reasons that they're not on the rolls. Most states that didn't have a provisional opportunity to cast a ballot before 2000, I think, added one after 2000. So that voter almost always is allowed to cast their ballot. If this needs to be judged in some way, it's done after the election. Sometimes it's easily figured out. Sometimes it turns out that the voter has already voted somewhere else, or the voter lives in another county, or the voter lives in another state. But they get a chance in most states to cast that ballot, even if there's a question about whether they're on the voter rolls. I'm concerned about the voter rolls, concerned about the infiltration of the voter rolls. I'm much more concerned that we secure the counting systems, that we're going to have another panel to talk about that the counting systems themselves be secure. I think it really is critical infrastructure. And Secretary Johnson, your August outreach to election officials, did you provide much information as to what it meant to become critical infrastructure, or did they have any reason to really understand why you were making this suggestion of a great change of responsibility 90 days before the election?
I went through with them in August in detail what a critical infrastructure designation would mean, and I explained essentially three things: that it prioritizes the assistance that we provide if they ask. It means for a certain greater level of confidential communications between DHS and the states, and it means that they would have the protection of the international cybersecurity norm. And I stressed at the time that this was all voluntary, and it prioritizes assistance if they seek it.
You know, we're going to have a Secretary of State on the next panel who I think was on that call, and I don't believe that's their view of how that conversation went, but we'll see what their view is. The other question, when you brought this up before, what would the protection of the international norm be? We've had our federal personnel records have been, somebody has those. We have all kinds of financial information that's been out there. What is the international norm supposed to provide here that it doesn't appear to provide anywhere else in terms of real protection?
The international norm is that nation states will not attack critical infrastructure. Now, obviously, it's incumbent upon the victim state to then do something about it if their critical infrastructure is attacked, but the designation makes clear that we consider election infrastructure to be critical infrastructure, like government, like our defense industry, like our financial services industry.
Well, I don't disagree that it's critical infrastructure. I'm not sure I agree that calling it critical infrastructure provides much of a level of security right now. My last question for this panel, Secretary Nielsen, you mentioned the Election Assistance Commission a couple of times. Do you have concerns that we're moving into an area here where that commission and your agency will not quite know where how do we define this in a way that creates the lines of responsibility so that somebody knows who is responsible and what they're responsible for?
Yeah, we're, as you know, DHS is working very closely with EAC. We've created a government coordinating council. EAC and DHS sit on that, along with a variety of state and local election officials. EAC certifies the systems. EAC has the voluntary voting system guidelines. We're working with them and NIST to update those. They need to be updated. We hope that the final draft will come out next month. We need to continue to work with them to expedite that so that we have a guideline that reflects the current threat. But I would say I think the role between DHS and EAC is clear right now. It's just making sure that we're doing it in lockstep so that we're together providing the assistance that the states need.
I may have some questions for the record on that topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, Secretary Johnson, good to have both of you here. I want to start by talking about the fact 43% of American voters use voting machines that researchers have found have serious security flaws, including backdoors. These companies are accountable to no one. They won't answer basic questions about their cybersecurity practices, and the biggest companies won't answer any questions at all. 5 states have no paper trail, and that means there is no way to prove the numbers the voting machines put out are legitimate. So much for Cybersecurity 101. My question to you, for Secretary Nielsen, is does your agency have the authority to mandate basic cybersecurity in the electronic voting machines used in this country?
No, sir.
Does any agency?
Not to my knowledge, not at the federal level.
Okay. Now, Americans don't expect states, much less county officials, to fight America's wars. The Russians have attacked our election infrastructure, leaving our defenses to states and local entities, in my view, is not an adequate response. Our country needs baseline, mandatory federal election security standards, and what I'm talking about here are paper ballots and post-election risk limiting audits. You and I have talked about this before, and I'd like to get your views for the record of whether you believe the continued use of paperless voting machines in this country threatens our national security, and the department is now prepared to recommend paper ballots.
So, yes, sir. If there's no way to audit the election, that is absolutely a national security concern. So we're working with states. There's a variety of ways to do that. As you know, one is paper ballots. One is having a system itself that has a voter-verified paper audit. So in other words, you vote electronically, but the machine spits out almost like a ticker tape what you voted, and you have that for your record, and then we can also have it for record. So it's a different way of doing it from paper ballots. But yes, sir, we absolutely have to have a way to audit and have be able to verify the integrity of the information of the votes.
I think that sounds like a step in the right direction, because I was just stunned at the brazenness of these voting machine companies. I mean, the biggest one won't answer anything at all, and you've now told us that the status quo is a national security threat. I just want to, before we wrap up, see if we can drill a little bit further into the question of whether you all are prepared to recommend that our country have paper ballots. I think You're almost there.
Sir, we had said it's a best practice. We do recommend it. What we say is you must have a way to audit. You can do it through paper ballots or you can do it through this voter verification, but you must have a way to audit and verify the election results.
Are you aware of the way we do it in Oregon? And we've done it now for decades. We vote by mail. Everybody gets a paper ballot. There is an audit trail. We've done it for decades. It's been supported by Democrats and Republicans. I'd like, in 2020, every American to get a ballot in the mail. I think it is a national scandal, the security issues you've talked about, and the idea that so many of our people wait in these lines only to be told they ought to go somewhere else. What do you think of the Oregon system?
So I'm not as familiar with it. I look forward to learning more about it. Some of the issues that, aside from this particular conversation, that have been raised with mail is just making sure that the person who's voting is who we think they are. So we do have to have a way to verify identity.
We'll show you how to do it because we've done it.
Happy to learn.
We've done it for 2 decades, and we basically say right on the envelope, if you aren't the person that you say you are in one heck of a bad way. You are going to face serious, serious penalties, and that's why it has worked and is supported on both sides of the aisle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you both for being here. I think it sends a very good message to see both of you sitting side by side and appearing to answer the committee's questions, and appreciate your service to the country. I want to start, Secretary Nielsen, by thanking you for your comments about the bombings in Austin. When I talked to Chief Manley at the Austin Police Department the day before yesterday, he told me there are roughly 500 federal authorities on the ground doing everything they could to identify the bomber. And as we learned today, he will not be doing that anymore. But it's important to remain vigilant, I think you also said, lest there be some other unexploded bombs out there that he might have planted. I'd like to ask both of you to comment on this. My understanding of our adversaries, whether they be Russia or China, as they view the internet and cyberspace far differently than we do. In other words, they view it as a domain for information warfare. They do not allow their citizens to use the internet for the purposes that we use it for commerce or for communication between friends and family, to share social media, pictures of grandkids, things like that. They use it as a weapon. And we don't. We are, and it seems like we are just constantly playing defense. And while I know today the topic of the hearing has to do with our election systems, and there couldn't be anything more important in terms of securing those election systems, it does raise the question about what is America's national security cyber strategy. And I know we learned that from the Department of Defense that they are late responding to a mandate in the Defense Authorization Act to respond in terms of their role, but clearly the Department of Homeland Security plays a very important role too. But you're not alone. There are other government agencies that are involved in this question. So what do you think it's going to take, and what do you recommend for the United States government that we do to create an all-of-government strategy to deal with the cyber threat? Maybe start with you, Secretary Johnson.
Senator, I think that's a very good question, and I think you have to look at several aspects of the problem. One, I think that when you're talking about a nation-state actor, we have to create an environment of sufficient deterrence to that nation-state. All nation-states will not engage, will refrain from behavior if it's cost-prohibitive behavior, if they know it's cost-prohibitive. The Department of Homeland Security has a role on defense in working with the public to harden our cyber security. I do think that, and I think your question touches on this, our open society, our strength as an open society is also our vulnerability. And we have to be somewhat careful in going down the road of having U.S. government agencies trying to regulate speech, trying to regulate political speech, political debate. As you know, they do that in other countries. We don't do that here. And so this is the information marketplace and its easy access is definitely a problem for our democracy. But I would hesitate for the U.S. government to go down the road to trying to regulate it in some way. There are matters of federal election law, to be sure, things that violate Title 18, but I happen to believe that a lot of this has to depend upon self-regulation by Internet service providers and social media providers.
Secretary Nielsen, do you think we have a national security strategy?
So we do.
When it comes to cyber?
We do, but having said that, the White House is working on an update to the National Cybersecurity Strategy. An update to DHS's strategy will nest within that. But I also want to just take the opportunity to reaffirm what you said. I think there's two parts to this, at least. There's the part we're talking about today, but then closely related to that is the malign foreign influence in general. I agree with Secretary Johnson. We have to be very careful in that conversation about substance, but I think the real issue is who is providing that substance. The example that I've used before is if I read something on the internet or social media, et cetera, and I believe that it's from 50 of my closest friends and neighbors, I might feel very differently if in turn I'm told that's from 50 machines in Russia. So it's not so much the substance as it is perhaps Americans need more understanding of who is messaging and the intent behind the messaging. So that is something that the DOJ, FBI, and State Department are leading on, but I do think is a very important part of this conversation.
If the chairman will permit me just one last comment, I think what I also think about is some of the social media companies basically throttling or censoring the news since they become a primary vehicle for people to learn what's happening in the world. If they then take that role as censors, what the implications of that might be. Something for us to think about and talk about maybe in the future.
Yes, be very careful.
Secretary Nielsen, your staff has accommodated a slight change in your schedule, if it's okay with you, that we would go we've got two members that are here, maybe a third one that might come back for questions. We will finish by 11:15 if you're in agreement.
Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you. Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Chairman, I spent about an hour yesterday afternoon reading the classified draft report of our committee on this subject. And all along, we've been talking about the Russians penetrating our systems and messing around with our elections. That's not sufficient. The language is what I learned yesterday was horrifying. What we saw wasn't messing around or penetrating. It was a sophisticated, thorough, comprehensive, malign, and malicious attack on our electoral system. And what worries me is that although the intelligence is uniform, that no votes were changed, they weren't doing it for fun in 2016. What it looks like is a test. And it was incredibly, as I say, thorough and comprehensive. I want to follow up on Senator Cornyn's question. We can patch software systems till the end of time, and we're not going to defeat these people. The history of warfare is the history of the invention of new offensive weapons, and then eventually defensive weapons catch up. We saw the advent of a serious offensive weapon in 2016 being used against us. All of the patches aren't going to work if we don't have a strategy of deterrence. And that's the point of the question that Senator Cornyn asked and Senator Heinrich asked, and we don't have that strategy. In 2016, we passed the National Defense Act. It had an amendment requiring the Secretary of Defense by last June to give us the elements of a national cyber strategy. It hasn't happened yet. 180 days from that report was supposed to be a report from the President. Of course, that hasn't happened yet because the first report hasn't happened. This problem is not being treated with the urgency that it deserves. And a deterrent strategy, because the problem now is the Russians sent in this whole operation into our election system, into our states, 21 states that we know of, and paid no price. And we've had testimony from admirals and generals and people in cybercom, and they've said, yes, Senator, there's no price that will change their calculation. And so, Secretary, I hope when you go back, and I'm not, this isn't, and by the way, this was a failure of the prior administration, in my view, because we've known this for 4 or 5 years that this was coming. So this isn't a partisan observation. But I hope you'll go back and join with D&I Coates and with Secretary Mattis and the President and make this the highest priority that we have. This is, I believe, with the possible exception of North Korea's nuclear weapons, this is the most serious threat that our country faces today, and we are not adequately dealing with it. And please expunge from your lexicon the word whole of government. Every time I hear that, I think that means none of government. I want to hear who's in charge and what they're going to do about that. So, Secretary Nielsen, I think you're in a key position, and you can, I hope you'll read this classified report.
I look forward to it.
It will terrify you, and I think and of course this is just one aspect of this attack on us. So I believe this is an incredibly important area. Now, let me ask a more specific question. You mentioned earlier we talked about clearance of state officials, and only 20 have been cleared. I hope that can be accelerated because we've already had several primary elections, and we're headed into many more this spring. Do you have plans to try to accelerate that clearance? Because communication won't work if you can't tell them.
No, we do, yes, sir. It is a problem that is not unique, unfortunately, to this particular stakeholder set. So I do look forward in general.
No, you're right. 791,000 clearances we're behind.
I know. So but what we have done is we've worked out the processes whereby if we have actionable information, we will provide it to the state and local officials on a day read-in. So we're not letting the lack of a clearance hold us back. We're in contact with them. If we have information to share with them with respect to a real threat, we will do so.
Let me make a modest suggestion, because we're going to have state officials here soon. We've had state officials before. The general reaction is, and I don't want to overcharacterize it, but the general reaction is we're doing a pretty good job. We're in good shape. I get the same thing in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee from utility executives. Don't worry, we've got it in hand. I don't believe that. You have the capability. This is my modest suggestion. Create a red team in DHS, a group of really skillful hackers, and hack some of these states and show them how vulnerable they are, because I don't think they're going to believe it until you show them what your people can do, and that made me. This country has to wake up. And this, I just suggest that as a possible technique. You've got some skilled people you can work with, NSA or Cybercom, and develop a red team that will kind of shock people into the realization of how serious and how vulnerable they are. Would you consider that suggestion?
We will consider it. We do try to currently get at that through our risk and vulnerability assessments. We continue to encourage states to take us up on that. That is a comprehensive assessment we do on site. It includes pen testing. It includes wireless access. It includes database. So it gets at some of what you're saying. But yes, sir, we need to help them understand where they're vulnerable.
Well, I appreciate your leadership and really urge you to go back with your hair on fire.
You have an advocate here.
This is an urgent matter. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. Seeing you back reminds me of the old country song, "How Can I Miss You If You Don't Go Away?"
Jeez.
Nice to see you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Risch.
I think that was meant as a compliment. You need to study the country songs, General, a little more, Senator. Look, we've all, you and everybody on this panel have looked at thousands of pages and done the interviews and reviewed everything there is. A simple question I have for you. Right now, we pretty much know what happened, and everybody's got an idea of what's happened. The question I have for you is, are either one of you aware, or has it been suggested to either one of you, or if you have seen any evidence of any kind that any U.S. person was involved in this scheme? Ms. Nielsen.
Not to my knowledge, no, sir.
Mr. Johnson?
You have to, I'm sorry to be a lawyer here. Which scheme are you referring to?
I'm talking about the Russian scheme to do what they did as far as attempting to interfere in the elections. The kinds of things we've been talking about this morning, the attacks, the penetrations, and what have you.
My recollection of the special counsel's indictment is that there were some U.S. citizens included in it. That's my recollection, but I could be wrong about that.
You want to follow up on that, Ms.
I have no knowledge, if we're talking about the topic of this hearing, which is the hacking of elections. I have no knowledge that a U.S. citizen was involved in that.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Manchin.
Let me just follow up on that very quickly, if I may. Do you all, either one of you all, have any doubt whatsoever, from what your knowledge in talking to the intelligence communities, that the Russians were involved at a higher level than they've ever been involved before?
I have no doubt.
No, sir, no doubt.
Okay. As a result of Russia's meddling in 2016, I'd fought to ensure the bill passed out of the Senate Appropriations Committee included a directive for DHS to provide technical assistance to state and local law enforcement to secure networks against cyber attacks. And before our committee this past year, I was shocked to learn that multiple federal agencies, including DHS, could not confirm that they did not have Kaspersky software in their system after we recognized the threat it posed to our national security. So my question would be, if our own Federal Department of Homeland Security has trouble finding a reliable vendor and relates to a Russian vendor such as Kaspersky, wouldn't you think our cash-strapped states and local partners might have the same problems?
The short answer to that is yes. As you know, we issued a binding operational directive to remove all such products from federal systems. We do not have authority to mandate that states do that, but we have taken
Have you removed Kaspersky's from yours?
Yes, sir. And we have taken it off the GSA catalog, as you know, which would allow states to purchase it with federal funds.
I generally agree with what the Secretary said.
The other thing, Russia or any other country that has been found guilty of meddling in our elections, which I think that we have confirmed by all our intelligence communities, what punishment or what recommendations of punishment or sanctions would you all recommend that would be stringent enough to prohibit that from happening, or any other country going down this path that Russia is going down?
Sir, I can just tell you, I think it's a very important question because we have a multifaceted relationship with Russia. We still seek their cooperation when it comes to North Korea, Syria, Iran, for example. So the consequences and what we do in reaction to their meddling in the election needs to be proportionate, but also needs to be driven in a way that they understand the specific behavior that we are seeking to avoid. And as the Secretary said, you know, the hope in general is that the international community continues to recognize that affecting and attacking critical infrastructure of another nation is a red line. As an international community, we all need to hold each other to that and recognize that that is a red line. So from a U.S. government perspective, we've looked at everything from sanctions back from the Obama administration to sanctions now to the PNGing of diplomats to indictments. We need to do more. We need to continue to make the point.
Let me expand on that. Should we treat a cyber attack or intrusion on our government, on our country, if sponsored, directed by a foreign government, which we know was an act of war?
We need to look at that very carefully. As you know, we have not made that decision as a country, either as a policy perspective or a congressional perspective. But I hope that we can work together and with other parts of the administration and decide where is that red line.
Secretary Johnson, do you think that we have deterred Russia from continuing their operations as far as trying to infiltrate our election system for the 2018 election?
No, we have not. Based on the testimony in this room last month from our intelligence chiefs.
So we're facing the same, if not worse?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Secretary Nielsen?
Yes, they will. There's no reason to believe they will not attempt again.
Well, if that's the case, then we have a nuclear weapons retaliation policy. Shouldn't we have a cyber retaliation policy?
I think that's what some of the members have asked about. Yes, we have an executive order 13800. Mr. King was mentioning, and Mr. Heinrich, what we need to do in terms of being very specific with respect to our deterrence. You have an advocate here. I will go back to my colleagues and the president and make sure that we get that done very soon.
We're coming down to the wire on the election, as you all know.
Agree.
The primary, most of our states have primaries very shortly, and a November election coming up, and we're faced with the same. And our states don't have the wherewithals in order to deter this if they're hooked to the internet in any way, shape, or form.
I'm happy to take that message back. As you know, DHS does not
Do you
do
believe the federal
offensive
government should be
cyber.
involved in helping secure the election process state by state?
We are.
Still
Yes,
state-
sir. We are. At their request, we're working state by state, locality by locality.
How much money do you all have targeted for this?
We've asked for another $25 million specifically to help our own resources. But as I've mentioned earlier, we've prioritized these. So we've
I'm saying,
prioritized.
do you all have a final recommendation on how you're advising the states to secure their system?
Oh, yes, we have many, depending on all of those different parts that I mentioned earlier.
Have they spoken back to you about the money? They don't have the money to either meet the requirements or suggestions you've made?
In some cases, yes, they have. Of course, they have resource constraints. Some of the machines themselves are old, as you know.
But it's a concern for the 2018 election.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senators. Secretaries, we've come to the end of this hearing. And Secretary Johnson, I'm not a lawyer, so I had to turn to our counsel. Of the 4 individuals that have been indicted by the special counsel, 2 were on lying to the FBI. The other 2 was a mix of bank fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud. So no individual that's been indicted by the special counsel. The other indictments, the other charges were directly at the IRA, the Russian facility that carried out. So if that helps to clarify your memory. And let me say to Senator Manchin that it's my understanding that the appropriators have taken care of in the omnibus bill an amount of money to be grants and other items. I don't want to speak for what their language is going to be, that mirrors the research that this committee did. And I want to thank Shelley Moore Capito, who chairs that Appropriations Committee, for working with our staff. And hopefully, I've made a commitment to Secretary Nielsen that we would be more than welcome, more than open to address any other needs as we see those as we move up to 18 or to 20. I want to thank both of you for your testimony today and your willingness to appear together. Everybody's said something about it, and I think it sends a strong message that the integrity of our election system is not a partisan issue, and it's truly the heart of the strength of our democracy. The committee's investigation found ample evidence to agree with DHS's assessment in 2016 that Russian government actors scanned an estimated 21 states and attempted to gain access to a handful of those. In at least one case, they were successful in penetrating a voter registration database. We've heard our witnesses confirm that assessment today. Despite that activity, I need to reiterate that the committee found no evidence of any vote totals that were changed, and a finding that was confirmed by our witnesses also today. The committee also discovered that Russian activities directed at the states fell in a seam of our national intelligence infrastructure. It was a foreign activity, but carried out on the United States, inside the United States, where our intelligence agencies have limited authorities. And I can't stress that enough, that we've got to consider that as we go forward. The intelligence community was therefore almost entirely dependent on the states for the insight into these activities. The committee found that DHS and FBI alerted states to the threat in the summer and fall of 16, but in a limited way. Our witnesses today confirmed that they provided warnings to state IT staff, but notifications to election officials were delayed nearly a year. States therefore understood that there was a cyber threat, but not the seriousness of the scope of that threat. This committee intends, hopefully before the end of the week, to produce an overview of our report that's sanitized, that can be released. The committee's full findings and recommendations on election security will be reviewed for declassification and possible redaction. And when that is complete, released to the American people so that they can then make their own judgments about involvement and attempts to intrude into our system. Once again, I want to thank both of you for being here. I want to conclude our first panel, 2-minute break as we bring the second panel up.
I prefer to talk if you have.